kind of felt that a little bit of a whiplash when I was reading this, because um, Locke would just be like, "Oh, you should, kind of find a judge and do appropriate reparations and figure out." But as soon as someone comes at you, all bets are off. You can kill the guy, or so it's kind of like a little bit of a whiplash moment there when you read that part.
Yes, no, exactly. And
I guess it was kind of the thinking of the frontier, because if you get robbed just before winter, it's just like that's it, you're gonna starve, kind of thing. So I guess it's frontier justice a little bit.
no, yeah, exactly. So yeah, and so I was thank you very much. And Sam, hi. And I was struck, as I was just saying with Tonicorn, at how quickly Hobbes, I beg your pardon, how quickly Locke seems to be then discussing in very similar terms to Hobbes notions of the need for law and order and the structuring of law. Of course, as we know, Locke is going to look at the parliamentary system or at representative government. The American Civil War a few hundred years later. And wait, Hobbes is right. But nonetheless, the great experiment in constitutional federal representative government that is the United States is very much grounded in both of these thinkers, I think. But yes, thank you very much indeed. And Samuel, what say you?
Well, it's much closer to the American Declaration of Independence, because there are lots of examples about Indians and what you do in America. It seems his inspiration is more towards the American than towards the existence in continental Europe, because continental Europe, I've been replaying a lot of my favorite game of one of my favorite games, Age of Empires 2. It's you have in Europe, you always have like invaders that go from east to west and sometimes west to east. But so it seems that like Tenocorn said, that the Locke's version of the state of nature, it's it's the embellished notion of an America where the Indians do everything freely. There's plenty of food. Like all you need is to find a way to share the abundance, instead of the Obvisian version, which is, well, everybody's going to try to kill everybody, and like the Mongols are coming or the Huns are coming, so better find like a strongman that will kill the invader, like be on the winning side, because the other side is dead.
Yeah, I would say like as I was reading through this, it's a very two-party kind of book. It's just really the dynamics of the ruler and the ruled, whether that's two commonwealths or like people within a commonwealth, or a parent and a child. There's very little relation of like outside powers. Like I think he brings up foreign usurpation once, and that was about it. So I guess once again, it's that frontier kind of like there's space everywhere. There's plenty enough room for everything. So there's no real conduct of like how does your commonwealth defend itself, as opposed to more like how do people behave within the commonwealth, or how do you constitute your commonwealth?
In degrees, yes. Let me offer some ideas though too. So Locke, the argument is Locke wrote in degrees much of this second treatise, several years before the Glorious Revolution in England, where William of Orange will come to power in a basically bloodless revolution. And so, there's arguments about how exactly Locke then claims that, first of all, he wrote it anonymously, and so took no credit during his time, during his lifetime. But as I understand, Locke nonetheless, claimed that he was dedicating this to the Glorious Revolution in England. So I do think that there are elements absolutely applicable to, and he, in fact, as you guys point out, references the America and Native American Indians and so forth. But I think, Locke is also very much, seeking to understand a structure for political government in a social, following Hobbes. Hobbes is going to, Hobbes very pointedly says there is just the physical world, right? Now, he also then does talk about God, but, and book 3, as people wonderfully said last week, on a Christian commonwealth, really made me go back and reread key elements of book 3, and I really appreciated that very much. But so what we're getting, as Dr. Sugrue said in his lecture for today as well, what we are getting with Hobbes and with Locke is a break from notions that legitimate political authority derives from God in degrees anyhow. Now that gets pretty complicated pretty quickly, especially with Locke. With Hobbes, I see Hobbes as a straightforward materialist. Everything that exists has extension. Everything that exists is physicalistic, is material. No exceptions whatsoever on Hobbes's view. And then Hobbes is building out a notion that we can come together because of our rational self-interest and create a Leviathan, right? My Leviathan here, right? Excuse me. We can create, this image, Leviathan. This is the frontis of his book, the front of Leviathan. And so the notion is although, as I say, last week, people really made me go back and take a look this last week at book 3 of Leviathan, and I have a fantastically better understanding of that, and I thank you all so much. I sincerely learn massive amounts every week from you guys. Really appreciate it. And I have right over here, give me one moment to lean forward, Darwin's Cathedral. Anyhow, I'll just show you the spine of the book, as I have too many things in my hands. But anyway, people were talking about Darwin's Cathedral last week, so thank you again for that. But gosh, the upshot of which is, I don't know. I mean, Locke, of course, in the years before the publication of the 2 treatises of government, Locke was the amanuensis. He was the secretary who wrote the Constitution of the Carolinas. And as Dr. Sugrue said, perhaps he was simply the secretary carrying out the proprietor's desire to include slavery and so forth. So Locke is very deeply aware of America, but I think it is a book about governance and building out from Hobbes the notion that we humans can together, don't have to necessarily, in Locke's view, we can have a social contract theory of government, as Hobbes asserts, and that we, in measures, confined by reason and confined for Locke by natural law, and in some measures Christian faith, we can build our own government, and we don't have to have a theocracy or that sort of thing. But in any event, Connor, welcome. What say you?
Can you hear me? I'm not sure if my computer's working properly or not.
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. I can't see you guys now, but I can hear you. One thing I was wondering about, and this could be, I think part of the problem is I was trained as a psychologist, not a philosopher. And so empiricism carries different connotations for us in terms of nature and nurture and all that kind of stuff. But I was interested by Locke's idea of natural law, and how that would be reconciled with his empiricism, because my understanding of Locke, which is admittedly quite a crude one, would be that he didn't believe in innate ideas, but yet he seems to suggest that there is a natural law which is universal, and he doesn't seem to speculate where it might come from. So I wonder if you'd be able to comment on that possibly.
I'm writing. That's a fantastic point. Yes. So Locke's reference in his other works to a tabula rasa, right, a blank slate upon which our experience writes, it is a key idea for Locke, and I think that I will demur to let us make this a question for Dr. Sugrue, because I think it is a terrific question. I do see in Locke very much that he asserts the critical centrality of reason and also the critical centrality of natural law and of God, in effect, through natural law, and on which many scholars have commented. And the answer, I don't know. What do other people think? This is, Connor, thank you very much. In other words, how do we get from the notion that we humans are born with a blank slate in our brain, or our mind is a blank slate upon which our experience writes, to a notion that there is a natural law written by God. Through reason, we can, certainly through faith, but also through reason, we can come to know that natural law, which is a law given by God. I don't know. Once again, I'm really wonderful. What say people? Any ideas?
Well,
go ahead.
well, the natural law could be that we are blank slate. Because the idea is that, what Locke draws a lot upon, it's the idea of parenthood. And one of the fun things that he says, it's that, if a father deserts his duty as a father, he no longer is a father, and the person who raises the child becomes the father and gets the due respect. And the natural, because a slate, it's not a natural thing. It's most of the time when you have a slate, it's been cleaned up, it's ready so that you can write upon. So in a sense, the natural law is that we take care of children, and children will learn what we teach them. But because, it's that it's natural that there's this stage in which we're, the expression is sponges who learn like whatever is around them. So it's that the two ideas coexist at the same time, because if we say that like we're blank slates that we draw upon, it's that somebody else drew upon, because you don't start from your own experience. You start with your parents, who start with their parents, who starts with their parents. It's so and the idea is that it seems so amazing what we can teach ourselves, that we tend to say that that we were clean so that we can learn that much. But it's we're a blank slate, but not 100% a blank slate. There are things that we latch on quite easily. It's if you lose your child at birth, it goes to the wrong parents or the wrong country, that child will learn quite easily whatever language it is exposed. It's it doesn't matter who the actual parents were, what were their language, the child will be able to learn whatever it is. And so that's how I switch between both of them. More blank slate because we follow the natural law of teaching.
Wonderful, Samuel. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, no, you're making me think back. You're making me have a number of different thoughts, of which I will share too. One is the very opening page, chapter 1, book 2, which is the second treatise, and then chapter 1. Although he is arguing, he's summing very quickly book 1, the first treatise on Filmer, who he is responding to. Nonetheless, there does seem to be a centrality of God and natural law, and God, natural law. And then, of course, Locke is saying, but we cannot know Adam's heir, right? Even if we go back to the biblical notion that the Bible, that there should be a successor here on earth, as Filmer is suggesting in his writing, as I read Locke, that we can't know who that heir is today, who the heir from Adam in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis. Who is Adam's heir to be the leader? Nonetheless, out of the gate, there is a very great reverence for religious faith. I am still, Connor, each week, each of you, each week, really, really, really delightfully make me rethink things, and I still, I'm stuck on innate ideas. Samuel, your excellent suggestion is then that we are born into a world, although we are blank slates. We have parents, they had parents, going backward in time, that we learn from our environment, from our families, not only our language. So if we were born into a particular mother and father, biological mother and father, but we ended up somehow getting mixed up, or I don't know, under whatever circumstance, the baby is raised in a different country with a different language, they would have then different traditions and different experiences. I think that's really well said. And one other personal note, in my extended family, and this is more than I should mention, but in my extended family, I went in rereading this last week, the second treatise of government here, when I got to the passage, Samuel, that you were just speaking about if a father abandons his children, then he loses a right to have any say over it. In more than we need to go into, but in a section of, I'll just say in a vague sort of way, but nonetheless, a divorce occurred just recently in my extended family, and the father has abandoned his two children. And as I was rereading what Samuel, as you were recounting, it just made me think very vividly about that circumstance. I thought it's irrelevant to in any effort to answer Connor's question, but nonetheless, yes, thank you. And my gosh, Jeremiah, you were going to say something. I'm sorry, Samuel.
I think I forgot what I was going to say exactly on the point of the question, since it's hard to both hold your answer and listen to someone else's answer at the same time. But I guess if I had a question to lead the discussion for a little bit, can you comment? Because I guess reading through the book, I didn't have a chance to look it up myself. But like, who's Berkeley that Locke keeps referencing? Like the great, apparently he through context you kind of get he's really in favor of the monarchy, but like he doesn't really explain why.
Help other persons. Another good question for Dr. Sugrue.
It wouldn't be George Berkeley, would it? The Irish empiricist, would it? George Berkeley, would it be him?
It may well be. Like I'm not from the States, so I'm not too familiar with American thought.
Oh, George Berkeley was an Irish philosopher, and he was one of the empiricists. And it's funny because yesterday I paid a visit to the library that George Berkeley here in Dublin would have played a part in founding. It's irrelevant, but I would assume it would be Berkeley because he would have been an influence in Locke. I'd imagine so anyway.
Yes, we will have to ask Dr. Sugrue. A great Jeremiah, thank you very much, but I don't know.
Fair enough. Dr. Sugrue did say like it takes a lot of self-restraint to say you don't know.
There you go. That's right.
I guess my other question is, Locke said a lot of this is based on his two principal rights, which is, you have the right to defend to use your property, and you have the other right, which is to kind of, essentially correct wrongs as you see fit, and you give up that second one to get all the rights of law. I guess like going back to Samuel's point, we're kind of blank slate, so we can adjust to the future, so we can keep changing what we think. But I guess with the theme of the course, or not really the theme, but like the thing that brought the course into focus is like the whole Ukrainian situation. Um, Locke said all this falls apart if you can't do what you want with your property. So when you have things like sanctions and asset forfeiture, like what do you risk when you have something like that on the books in terms of Locke's way of constructing the world, I guess?
Ah, I see, by the way, William Barclay, perhaps the founder of the Carolinas, but in all events, yes, Jeremiah, thank you very much. So the notions of, I mean, clearly Locke is these two notions that you introduce, the use of your property, you have a right to, absolutely. So what occurs in the world when people try to interfere with that property right is a terrifically interesting question, right? And so as you will have seen, and I marked in my book, the concept of property for Locke, bear with me, very famously, Locke includes, when we think of property, we think of something that we own, I think. But Locke, this is chapter 9, section 123, Locke says his definition of property includes our lives, our freedom, and the things that we own, our estates, which I call by the general name property. And so Locke's notion of property is expansive and at the same time, really fascinating and very important. So first of all, as you will have gathered, when we think not of our lives and liberty, but of the things that we claim ownership of, Locke straightforwardly offers us a labor theory of value, right? So he says, if the apple is on the tree and no one picks the apple, then what good does it do? But by introducing your labor to pick that apple, you have introduced labor and you then gain ownership. And then, gosh, that gets into the claim that the natural world around us is to be held in common, but that we can take elements of that natural world around us and claim ownership by investing our property by investing our labor to make it our own. And then very quickly and really fascinatingly, you get into iterations that are so deeply important in the modern world and back in the 17th and 18th centuries. And what can Locke mean practically by investing your labor? Because if a workman in an assembly line is helping to put together an automobile, what fraction of that property should that automobile assembly line worker take? If the car sells for $40,000, does that worker on the assembly line properly derive, his fair share of that of the making of that car from the investment of the labor, which then the car is sold? How is it that investors and owners and managers also, and of course the claim I get and build out. So one can very quickly, the notion of property seems so central. And I will say a few other things if I may. So then when we get to the American Revolution, Federalist 10 by James Madison, after the writing of the Constitution of the United States, John Jay, who only wrote 5, or there are 4 or 5 of the Federalist Papers, James Madison, who wrote many of them, and Alexander Hamilton wrote 85 different articles in the newspaper, all of which were signed Publius, a pen name. They all used that same pen name for these papers now called the Federalist Papers. But really fascinatingly, time and again in his life, James Madison in the context of the United States Constitution, which is interesting to me because I live in the United States and because John Locke's work, the second treatise of government, is considered central by many scholars to the structuring of the United States Constitution. James Madison really underscores in Federalist 10 the central importance of prohibiting the tyranny of the majority, because Madison asserts the right to property. Madison explicitly builds out a concern that people will try to obtrude, push onto you their religious belief, and he talks about that in Federalist 10, and how we want to try to structure a government in which a religious majority cannot engage in a tyranny forcing upon you their religious views. But he's also really fascinated, James Madison is, in Federalist 10, in this question of we want to craft a government to make sure that your property is yours and cannot be stolen by the majority. And I'll say just one more thing in that regard then, and Jeremiah, thank you very much. Tangled up in this, or interwoven with this, I don't know about tangled up, but interwoven with this are notions of private property ownership as central to freedom, right? So some notion is, I myself have worked very hard. I have made a certain amount of money, which I have, say, in my bank account. That money that I have tenaciously and through hard labor worked to achieve is I have through my own freedom, I have chosen to go to university, to study, to make money by having a certain job. And then I, through that hard fought labor, have achieved a savings or have achieved money to buy food for myself and my family. And that Locke, I beg your pardon, James Madison, and I think it's in concert with Locke, both of them see the tied one's labor. There's some sort of a logic going on that is, one makes decisions to engage in certain kinds of labor in the marketplace. Having done that, you get money from that engagement on the view that it's all legal. You're not stealing the money. You're following the rules of the political economy. You follow the rules, you make a certain amount of money, and that is absolutely yours. And that is tied up with notions of your own ability, your own decision-making, your own energy, and your freedom to decide to expend your effort in yesterday, visiting the library of the other Barclay, and so forth. So I don't know if that's useful at all, Jeremiah, but for sure, a very central thing here for Locke is notions of property, where property means life, liberty, and also estate, as he says. That is to say, the things that you own. And then again, he goes off and says, well, when you have invested your labor in this, it becomes yours. And so that the physical property that you own, the money you have, the car you have, the house you have, those things are in some measures intricately interwoven with notions of individual liberty. And that seems to be deeply important, not only for Locke, but for thinkers in the American tradition. I'm just picking on James Madison and Federalist 10. But Jeremiah, I don't know if that was at all of interest, but a terrifically interesting question. And I think you accessed, or beg your pardon, you referenced Ukraine and things like that, for sure. Very good. But others, what have people to say about this, or something else as well? Yes, thank you very much. Go ahead. Yes, Sam.
Oh, I just wanted to say, yeah, like you were saying, even Locke in his book recognizes, like I guess the market and like having, I guess just massive numbers for your wealth, it was less meaningful. And like the way he phrased this, like if my county goes to war with your county, like I may have reparations for like 3 or 4 seasons of worth of harvest, and then it's over. Like anything after 5 years, it's like that can't be me anymore, because like we were only fighting for so long. So it's kind of enlightening to see how people thought of value and how they marked productivity is so different from what a globalized economy is now than back then.
Yes, and I nicely said. And yes, the notion of that Tanakorn introduces of lawful property seems useful to me in the sense that, I think too, I just reread last year Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is, I don't know, 1,200 pages long or whatever. But in Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith is building out notions of commercial society and, to use Tanakorn's good concept, lawful property. And, I guess I'm really fascinated too by the traditional notions of lawful property have something to do with I have invested my labor in this, but then it gets really murky for me in was people sometimes say problematized, I don't know, but in my rereading this last week of all of the second treatise of government by Locke, because just what you were saying is Jeremiah is one element in that. How long do you get to own this property at a certain time? But then Locke also I was struck again in rereading it, that Locke says, well, if the tomatoes you have harvested are rotting, or he doesn't use tomatoes, but whatever, the apple that you have picked or the food you have picked is rotting, that's no good. That's not sensible, and that's not part of the natural order. But he said you can sell that for gold and silver, which don't rot, and then you can, I have the passages marked, I won't, then you can have as much of that as you want. You can accumulate as much wealth as you want, grounded in your labor. But, I also think too of, so Adam Smith is very powerful to me and in my understanding of the concept of lawful property. But I also think of Marxist analysis, or even President Obama, said that when an entrepreneur makes money, they didn't do that themselves. That, in a Marxist critique, which would talk about how the entrepreneur who owns the corporation in which the proletarian, the workers, are working, how is it that the owner of the corporation, if we have a labor theory of value, at least in some passages of Karl Marx is asserting, as I read him, that look, the workers on the, I'm fast forwarding to an example he doesn't use, but on an assembly line in a General Motors factory or a Toyota factory making automobiles, the workers are investing their labor. If we want to stick with a labor theory of value, then how is it that the workers shouldn't rise up? You have a world to gain, right? Cast off your chains and seize control properly of the product of your labor, because smash the bourgeoisie. We need socialism. We need to reappropriate property rights, because if we're going to look at property, we can see it as an organic whole. We make our profits by driving on the public roads and by all the society is a fabric, and in the context of that fabric, how is it that we would privilege the lawful property of the bourgeoisie, right? And I am not a Marxist. I really like Adam Smith, to be clear. But in any event, on this time in rereading Locke, I was really struck in my reading of Locke, that the centrality of property, and I can see how John Adams, James Madison, in the American context, the Lockean notion of private property is really central. It really struck me in rereading Locke that and I know maybe it's not interesting to other people, but I found it quite fascinating that in Federalist 10, along with we do not want the majority to force their religion on us, very well, but there will be a majority of people who will wish to take the money of the wealthy and redistribute it. And this is in the political left, the progressive left in the United States, in many measures looks at the world that way. And James Madison is saying, no. The reason we're creating the federal government with all of its complexities, the United States Constitution is a complex document, is to block majorities from tyrannizing, from getting their way with regard to property in particular. So again, what other thoughts do people have about this or other things in the book? Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. So I see, I guess I go largely with Plato and Hobbes and Locke. Wait, you can't do that. You answer the question. Redirect. You can't do that. What is human nature? This is a magnificently interesting question. What is the state of nature? I am very partial to Machiavelli and also to Hobbes in this regard, but I also have deep affection for Plato's Republic. I was just discussing with the president of my university on Friday both of our reverence for and appreciation of, I don't think Plato has it completely correct by any means, but Plato's Republic. So, we need to be mindful of the many different aspects of what we humans are. There's this, and so the reason I love to read these books and reread them, the reason that I love to think about and to teach these different ideas is because Tanakorn, in some measure, the entirety of my pedagogical effort, the entirety of my teaching effort is to look at the astonishing beauty and complexity of what counts as human nature. And so and I grew up as I have said before, in the Roman Catholic tradition. That is a very powerful part of my own being. It just, because going back to Samuel's good comment about one learns from one's parents and one's father about the world. So there's a quality to me that is just a part of the fabric of who I am, which is sort of if I was a computer, I was a fundamental formatting of the disk occurred not as DOS or not in some other fundamental formatting, but it occurred as a kind of fundamental formatting in the Catholic Church as I was raised. So that's one element in human nature. And I think I'm going on too long. And you sort of said pick between Hobbes and Locke. Between Hobbes and Locke, I think, as I was saying earlier, and I'll try to stop after saying this, I just find all of this, Aristotle, this effort, what makes these books really great, in my view, is that each one is exploring the world from a very different perspective, right? Machiavelli sort of knocks off the table claims about ontology. What exists? Is it only material, says Hobbes? My gosh, Connor's superb point. You guys make me rethink this stuff so much. I'm going to cherish my notes from our gatherings each week and sincerely reread them many times and rethink. Anyway, anyway, I will let others talk, and I'm also concerned that I'm going on here. The upshot of which is yes or no, Riccuti, which one? I guess I am partial to Hobbes in the sense that I think in a state of nature, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I think we do well to understand that we are creatures of love and creatures of compassion. And one aspires to or hopes that we have a quality that, that Locke wants to underscore. Reason, which brings in natural law, is a method of bringing in natural law for Locke. I think that is very, very important as well. In a crass, crude pick between Hobbes and Locke, because I think, as I was saying at the beginning of our gathering here today, I was struck very much about how Locke so very quickly talks about how Tanakorn, in your opening comments, articulating Locke's vision of the state of nature. I think you did an excellent job. And I think you're exactly right. It is an upbeat and positive portrayal of the state of nature. But on my reading this time, very quickly in the text, Locke gets to the state of war. When, in a state of nature, when someone comes up to me and robs me, I have the right to kill them immediately because, I don't know if they're also going to try to kill me along with stealing my property. And my property is both the physical things I have that I'm carrying on horseback, but also my own physical being is part of my property, as I pointed to in the text. And so I think that in a measure, I was struck by how much Locke, that the state of nature is not super. I mean, I see it. It is, as you characterized it at the beginning, Tanakorn quite rightly characterized it, is much, much, much more positive for Locke. Very well. But I also see very quickly that John Locke is very quickly saying, well, but on the other hand, practically, as we interact with each other, we're in a state of the sort of state of nature, which Locke calls the state of war, that Hobbes calls the state of nature. So in any event, I don't know, that was very long, but probably not very useful. Yes, Hobbes. For all of that said. But oh my gosh, I see that it in some measures, and you guys are always terrific. I see that in some measures we want to switch over and discuss things with Dr. Sugrue. So the George Berkeley thing, I think George, or not, I'm sorry, the William Berkeley that Locke references is, I think, a proprietor of the Carolinas, but I could be wrong. And the other questions that we had, Connor's terrific question about tabula rasa to notions of natural law and God. It struck me again, and very importantly, or to me, that Locke very much, God is deeply important to Locke in ways that for, anyway, I'll stop. But thank you very much indeed. Let's switch over. Oh my gosh, thank you all. Thank you very, very much. I so enjoy learning from you guys. Hey, let's go to what Dr. Sugrue has to say.
See you guys in a sec.
Thank you. See you in 1 second. Yes. Hi, Genevieve. Thank you for sending the videos a little earlier this week. It was super, super, super helpful. Thank you. We in our group discussion, we had a bunch of questions that I myself, this is John Ricciuti speaking, that I myself could not answer. And I think the persons in my group will bring forward some of those ideas for your dad to discuss.
Cool. Well, once again, you're very welcome. I'm just sending out the link to him right now.
Yeah. Oh. Thanks again for organizing all this.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm very glad that you like them. There's still more to be uploaded.
Hello?
No one else has their camera on right now, but is it working for you?
I think so.
I just turned mine on. Yeah. Can you see us?
I see two of you.
Okay.
I see you and one
That's
other.
fine.
All right.
Yep. So we're still waiting for people to come in.
Sure. Okay. Locke is such a relief after Hobbes.
Yes, yes. So much more positive. Although he does have whiplash moments where he's just like, yeah, we should do everything proportionally, and then you try to rob me, you can die.
Yeah. Well, that's because when you take someone's property, as in their food, you are threatening their life. And so what they're doing is defending their life. But you have to stretch to make it that, because it's not always the case.
Yeah, I think he mentions that, like, where he brings the highwayman versus like getting off the horse and giving your friend the money, and then he doesn't want to give it back. It's just like, you can't kill your friend, but you can kill the highwayman.
That's why your friend is your friend.
Yeah.
Hobbes would say, you go ahead and kill him. It's not a problem.
Do you think though that there's like a risk in that? Like, because Locke says, you get two rights. You get to use your property how you choose, and you get to defend any wrongdoings done to you, and you give up the second one to get all the rights that you would get from your agreed set of laws. But when, the thing that inspired this course, like the Ukraine war with the sanctions and all that, once you have something like that on the books, like he says, this all only works because people can do what they want with what they have. Like, what do you risk once you have something like that on the books?
You're right. Remember that although for Locke, you're going to be subject to a social contract. If the sovereign isn't around, you're still, as in Hobbes, going to be entitled to defend your life, and that's going to involve defending your property, because Locke's idea of property is bigger than what we usually think of it. It's not stocks and bonds. It's not just real estate. It's also things like food and air. All right. So it can be a matter of life or death, and in which case you're always going to retain the right to self-defense. But he never explains exactly how you know where to draw the line, which is a problem. Drawing the line is always a problem with Locke. That's part of why he gets away with being such a cheerful political theorist for the most part. And there are very few cheerful political theorists. Most of it is kind of dour and glowering, because there's a lot of finger wagging among people that write about political philosophy, because the world is messed up and they're going to explain to you how to fix it. Locke pretty much likes it the way it is. Yes, it can be tinkered with, but for the most part, we got it right, unlike, say, Hobbes, or for that matter, Rousseau, who thinks that we've messed up badly. Hello, where is everybody? Are they still in their discussion sections?
Yeah, they're still coming in.
Okay.
It might be a minute. You can keep talking if you'd want, though, because we do have a couple people here.
Okay. Questions? What do you think of our friend Locke?
I think it's nice that he has like a built-in, because if it's Hobbes, you just if every day is the worst day ever and it's just every day is worse than the last, you just have to passively accept it, where this one has at least a mechanism where you can argue for something better.
Yeah, the idea is that he's escaped the binary that Hobbes is locked into. He said, look, it's not just either or. Either you're in the state of nature or you have a government which is awful. He said there are degrees of awful government. Some of them are more awful than others. And when they get to be too awful, and when they get to be destructive of the rights that they're created to protect, and it's more than just the right to life, it's the life to flourish and thrive, then you have the right to alter and abolish it. That's what Jefferson put into the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of stuff in the American political tradition at the age of the American founders that's lifted directly from Locke. Right? So Jefferson originally wrote life, liberty, and property is what people are allowed to do. Benjamin Franklin said that sounds a little crass. Why don't we just change property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And Jefferson was okay with that because the idea was you can't pursue happiness if you don't have the things you need to survive. Sometimes in practical terms, as opposed to theory, political theory, keeping things ambiguous can be a smart move, right? In other words, let the next generation, as historical events modify the world around us, let them figure it out, right? You don't need to solve all your problems now. It's tempting to try and do that, but sometimes a strategic ambiguity in practice allows people to figure out, well, how to modify a written document without actually changing the document or rejecting it. So there's a genius to creative ambiguity. If you've ever graded undergraduate papers, you know what I mean, right? Because often undergraduates have a hard time saying what they mean. And that could mean a couple of different things. And if you're feeling charitable, well, then that's the right answer. And if you're not, you see, this could be taken in a lot of different ways. And most of them are bad. All right. So strategic ambiguity has something to be said for it. Locke, at least for Americans, is like a trip home because so much of the American political tradition presupposes this, right? Those from outside the American political tradition might find this a bit on the optimistic side and also are going to likely have questions about that ambiguity that's built in. But so many of the founders of the US were Lockeans, and that it shows up in all their founding documents. What you have to do to have the outlook the American founders had, people that put the Constitution together, and the people that wrote the Federalist Papers, is they found a way to combine Locke and a kind of very attenuated Calvinist assumption about the imperfectibility of human beings. So, and I think that's a very wise thing. It's very dangerous to embark on political reformation or even revolution with the intention of perfecting people and perfecting the world. That inevitably leads to the most dangerous kind of tyranny. You have to give people a little bit of wiggle room. You have to allow for the fact that theory never gets translated perfectly into practice. And if you try and do that, what you do is you get something like the terror of the French Revolution, right? And yeah, it may make logical sense, but making logical sense isn't everything. Right. So finding some way of muddling along in practice may involve certain kind of infelicitous or not even completely coherent political beliefs. And although in theory, it's nice to have a clear logical structure that you're trying to follow. Think of Plato's Republic. It'd be absolutely catastrophic to try and put that into effect. Anyone who does is going to end up destroying his society and likely destroying himself. Locke says a little bit of this, a little bit of that, we're okay. You know, you protect your main rights, and every once in a while they'll get violated, but it probably won't be a sufficiently gross violation so that you should have a civil war or a revolution or something. On the other hand, if sooner or later, human beings being flawed and not perfectible, sooner or later they're going to cross that line, and then you have to cash in the old government and get a new one. You might wonder, well, at what point do they cross that line? He said, the people shall judge. In other words, figure it out amongst yourselves, right? Don't bother me with that. I can't give you a hard and fast rule that's going to cover every situation. That's wise, and it's also rather frustrating, because what it does is say, look, work it out yourself. And what that means is that it's not really rule governed. He doesn't even tell us who the people are. I mean, there's never been a revolution that's been pursued by every person that's not part of the government that makes up a society. So it's always some fraction, some fragment. How big a fraction do you need? Half? More than half? Well, how do you grow from one dissatisfied person to more than half without being in the domain of being seditious? It's not easy. All right. The most effective revolutions. There's a very good book. It's an old book now, but because it was around when I was in college. But there's a very good book called by Manker Olson. It's called The Logic of Collective Action. And what he shows is something that's very counterintuitive. The fewer people you have involved in a movement, the more effective the movement is, because they're closely interconnected in a kind of network, and they don't have the problem of moving a vast number of people in a particular direction. That's why, for example, movements like Jacobinism or Puritanism or Bolshevism were all small numbers of people that were fanatically dedicated to something, and they were able to be extremely effective because they were a small elite cadre, right? It's much harder to get some dinosaur-size collection of people to agree on anything and to get anything accomplished. That's a big part of. I mean, think about the two parties that that are current in America and have been current for a long time. These are gigantic, 100 million people plus, and you might ask, what do they all agree on? Right? How do you get them all to move in the same direction? I mean, you're lucky if you get 2/3 of each party to actually vote in an election, much less to agree upon what they're voting on and why. So it turns out that small numbers of people are most effective in overthrowing governments. And the problem there is they won't have, or at least it's hard to see how they would have Lockean legitimacy because, well, how do you know you speak for the people? I mean, in contemporary governments, everybody claims to be speaking on behalf of the people. And regrettably, sometimes the people don't know what's good for them. So a small number of people, like say Ayatollah Khomeini and the real Islamist fanatics in Iran, they're going to give the people what they should want if they were as smart as Ayatollah Khomeini. All right. This is also a recipe for tyranny as well as revolution. Right? And it works for pretty much any revolution that actually happens. If it's practically feasible, it's feasible because only a small number of people are actually doing it. And if they claim to be working on behalf of the consent of the governed, well, then it's peculiar that they don't exactly get the consent of the governed, often by, say, not having elections, right? The Cuban Revolution, I mean, that was 1959. They haven't yet gotten around to having elections because they know that they're in advance, a priori, that they're doing what the people want and what's in their interest because they know best. Okay, that leaves an awful lot of wiggle room for totalitarian or authoritarian governments. Same is true for right-wing usurpers like the Nazi Party. They don't have to be big, they just have to be well coordinated and fanatical, right? Granted, they were Hitler was voted in 1934, but my guess is the number of people that were involved in that probably were a little bit like the people that support either the Democratic or Republican parties in America, that they had very little in common. They weren't quite sure what they were voting for. They sort of liked the public image this guy was giving us, and they had no idea what was hidden underneath, or they had no clear idea of what was hidden underneath. So large popular movements are very hard to make, to create practical change with. Small fanatical movements are good at that. The problem is that even though they claim to be representing the will of the people or the consent of the governed, they usually find it kind of awkward to get that in practice. So they just repeat endlessly that we represent the people. And if the people don't like it, we'll put them in camps. Right? That's the downside of it. How did Locke seem compared to Hobbes for you? Yeah, you're all kind of smiling. Yeah, this is a great relief. Right.
Seemed a lot more, I guess, familiar.
Okay, if you're an American in particular, it is much more familiar, right? There are bits and pieces of Hobbes that we get, like the Fifth Amendment, but much of this is designed to create a Lockean legitimacy, right? And thank God, it's a little bit more optimistic about human nature. In other words, in Hobbes, everybody's bad all the time. It's just awful. With Locke, he says, look, most people most of the time are pretty sociable. Parents rarely kill their children. Neighbors sometimes will disagree, but rarely do they want to burn down the neighbor's house and slaughter his family. Hobbes says, well, you can never be sure. And Locke says, well, you can't be sure, but we're not looking for surety. We're looking for generalizations about the way people behave. And in general, people are sociable as well as unsociable, and that should figure into your political theory, right? We can't be stuck with just worst case possibilities, because that foregoes the possibility of creating better and worse real world political orders, right? So I'm often worried about optimistic views of human nature. I think Locke finds that nice Aristotelian or kind of a Goldilocks spot, not too much, not too little. Hobbes, I think, is just too negative about human nature, and Rousseau, I think, is just too positive about human nature. He says, look, everyone's good all the time except when society emerges, and then people start being bad, and then we get inequality and all that stuff. The problem that you're going to get with Rousseau is that if all these individuals are naturally good, how is it when you put a bunch of them together, they become so wicked? Where does that come from? Apparently from none of the things that make it up. Okay, well then you have to explain to us how this thing that isn't in the individual, say, atoms of society, when you put the atoms together to make an object, how is it that they have a different set of properties? Something similar is true of Hobbes. These atoms should all repel each other. We shouldn't be able to put them into any kind of larger structure. But he says, yeah, if you're feared enough, you can make that work, but you have to be scary. You have to be terrifying. All right. I like the fact that, what is it Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics? Virtue is a mean between two vices. Don't overestimate human nastiness, but don't overestimate human goodness either. I think that Locke finds a nice middle ground between the other two famous social contractarians. And he says, look, people are often, and perhaps the majority of the time, they're sociable. I mean, we're social animals, but there's a fly in the ointment. And here we go back to what I would call a kind of submerged Calvinism. And of course, Calvinism means St. Augustine, because that's where all the Calvinists got their idea of human depravity. He says, sooner or later, some joker is going to decide that he's a hero and he's going to kill his neighbor or steal his neighbor's property or otherwise treat his neighbor badly. And then we're going to have to do something. Because if you don't stop it after the first time, it's going to happen again. And it's going to happen again. And you're going to have to find some mechanism by which to stop that. So I like the realism in that. In other words, I don't want to kill my neighbors. I mean, I don't have any rage towards them. But on the other hand, I don't assume that they're perfectly good people either. I just said, live and let live. That's kind of the Lockean ethos. If there are people that won't allow you to live and let live, if they commit murder or theft or other violations of natural law, remember when we talked about Aquinas? And we had Aquinas' idea that rational human beings can see not just how the world is, but also how the world ought to be, that it's possible to get a rational understanding of what's permissible and what's not, and that gets taken from the Stoics. I mean, it looks Christian, but actually smuggled that into Christianity from the Roman Stoics. I think it's a plausible idea. The problem is that although human reason can tell you stuff like you shouldn't murder your family and stuff, the problem is that the borderline cases are real fuzzy. How much love should you give to your neighbor? Well, it's hard to say, and it also sort of depends on the neighbor. I'm not a saint, so I can't give infinite love to everybody. Leave that to Jesus, all right? Me, I'd like to get along with people. I don't want to destroy my neighbor, but I don't want to become Mother Teresa either, right? I'm not Gandhi. So where do we find that proper fuzzy middle? Well, that's the thing about Aristotle, and that's why he drives Kant crazy. There's no rule governing it. He says, figure it out yourself. Be practical, be sensible, and there's some place in the middle. Yeah, it's fuzzy, but grow up. That's just the way thinking about right and wrong is. Okay, so I understand that that's a practical and sensible idea. I do wish that we could get a little more, actually a lot more focus on it so that we could get clear, bright lines of distinction. Those of you who are familiar with Kant's Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals say, I have a line for you. It's called the categorical imperative. There it is, one side or the other, back to binaries. All right. And then once you get that, then I begin to think maybe Aristotle wasn't so bad, right? Because of the nightmare cases of that. So we are looking for a home for our moral intuitions. And I think our moral intuitions are inevitably at sea and never seem to find a port that gives us shelter under all circumstances. You know, I've studied a lot of moral theory, and I wish that we could find that silver bullet that kills all monsters, but I don't know that there is. And of course, this is homage to Aristotle. All right. What else? Come on, I got a couple of hands, 5 hands sticking up. So somebody ask a question.
I wanted to ask, what is the significance of William Berkeley, and what philosophical position did he have in relation to Locke?
Okay, Bishop Berkeley is fun. All right, he's in the line of Descartes, but only in the sense that Hobbes is. He takes a section of Descartes and runs with the ball. Bishop Berkeley says, you know what? Since all of my experience goes on in my consciousness, I don't need an external material world at all. All I need is a consciousness, and there may or may not be an external world. I mean, Descartes finds a very dubious way of showing us that the external world is real and certain and knowable, but he says you really don't need one. As long as you have this theater between your ears, you could just believe in that, and it doesn't make any difference whether there's anything external to you that correlates to that. So it's a kind of radical idealism that moves in the direction of solipsism. And I think it was Dr. Johnson who heard Bishop Berkeley's theories, and someone asked him about it while they were walking down the road, and Dr. Johnson kicked a stone and he said, I refute it thus. Right? So, yeah, you don't think there's a real external world? That's my refutation. Because, I mean, it's not logically incoherent. It's just that it's at odds with our intuitions about the world. The world is going to be a very weird and lonely place if all the stuff that you think you're experiencing in the external world, which will include things like other people, if that's just something that goes on in your head and there's no way of knowing whether that corresponds to anything outside of you, that's kind of hard. It also means it's stuff that, for example, we have the idea of object permanence. What that means is this. When I pick up my coffee cup and you see it, you're likely to believe that before I brought that into your view, that there was a coffee cup there. And also, after you could no longer see it, there was still a coffee cup there. But Bishop Berkeley said, how do you know? You're not having the experience of it. That's a dogma, which it is, but it's also sane. Right? Now, you have to remember that babies don't initially have this. This is something that people actually develop over time. When my children were first born, I used to hold them and, you know, they would look at me and I would look at them and I would know that they were still the same baby that I picked up yesterday. Whereas when they're very little, they're thinking to themselves, he looks a lot like that guy I saw yesterday. And the day after that, and the day after that, and they're going to be close to a year old before they get the idea of, oh, damn, that's the same guy. Right? All right. So Bishop Berkeley is bringing us back to the innocence, but also the lack of common sense that you find in infants. All right. So Locke doesn't want to go down that road. It's not that it doesn't make sense. It's that making sense isn't everything. All right. I prefer to hold on to the idea that there's an external world, and even this would be contra Descartes. I even think that there are other people in that external world, not zombies moving around that sort of look like people. My guess is, and again, it's hard to justify this because I've never had anybody else's experiences but my own, but I have a powerful emotional need to believe that other people are experiencing the world in roughly the same way that I am, and that there's someone inside the machine, that there's a ghost in the machine of their body, and that that's them. How do I justify that? It's a poser. I mean, that's a real hard question to justify. Doesn't make me doubt it, but there's a whole bunch of things that we can doubt and that amount to irrefutable skepticisms, right? You have to learn not to take the bait and not to pursue every skeptical argument that you encounter. Is some good advice. There's plenty of skepticism that just has no answer, and the best answer is not to prove that the skepticism is wrong, because you usually can't. Rather, you just say, what difference does that make? In other words, how should I change my life now? All right. Think of skepticisms to the effect that the world that you remember never happened. A demon here's a Cartesian demon who just put all your memories for a whole lifetime in your brain 10 seconds ago. Or if you want to do it with space rather than time, how about the idea that three-dimensional space only exists within 50 meters of you? And once you get past that, it's all painted on the perimeter of that 50 meters. But as you move in that direction, the other dimension pops out, and then you get your 3 dimensions. There's no way to prove that wrong, because wherever you are, you're not 50 meters from where you are. And if you throw a ball more than 50 meters, it could magically turn into a 2-dimensional thing. You don't know, right? It would look just the same way it does. You get the same info from your senses. The answer here is not to chase rabbits that you can't catch. The answer is to say, okay, this is all very clever. What is it you think that this is important for? And then watch them squirm. All right. So be careful of radical kinds of skepticism. You can't win against these people. The point is to ask them what they think they've won by bringing you this skepticism. As Hume would say, because he's the guy who knows how to moderate skepticism beautifully, he said, what is the meaning of all these unusual researches? See, I mean, that's why Hume doesn't say, I'm an atheist. He says, that seems very improbable to me. Because he's too sensitive to be dogmatic about a thing like whether God exists. And I said, what the hell do I know? Doesn't seem very likely. And there are lots of things that don't seem likely. But he avoids dogmatic skepticism, which is one of the things that makes Hume such a genius. All right. He never goes beyond the evidence. And if you ask him, what's the importance of this? He says, it's so you chill out and don't be a fanatic about anything. Who could not like that? So self-conscious skeptics are the best kind. Most of them are just undergraduates trying to be cute. All right. What else? Yeah.
If I may, because you brought up Aristotle and you brought up one of the things, it's not my job to kind of tell you what it is, what ought to be. You figure it out. And this is something that's been kind of like jostled in my head ever since that lecture on Aristotle, because Jürgen Habermas, I think you brought up Jürgen Habermas in that. Oh, and you mentioned something about theory of communicative action, and it got me very excited because I wrote my senior thesis on it. And you said that there was a lot of hubris in that.
Yeah.
And I guess here's kind of where I'm coming from, because Locke seems to be talking about people getting together, arriving, some sort of reasonable process where I decide what's mine, you decide what's yours, and we agree on it, and then we just get on with our lives. And isn't that what communicative rationality is? And I guess provided that there's no overarching value that's imposed, that the people have to figure it out. I guess my question is, where is the hubris in the kind of communicative action and communicative rationality of Habermas?
Okay, that's a good question. Those of you who don't know Habermas, well worth your time to encounter this. But Habermas is trying to reinstate the privileged status, which I have considerable sympathy for, of being reasonable. Right? We live in a postmodern age where reason itself is called into question. But exactly what you call it into question with, and how you would want a question to be resolved without using reason is never clear. And then you get, ha ha ha, I'm so ironic. I actually met Habermas once when I was in graduate school. This is a long time ago. And I had been reading him and thinking about him. And the question I asked him, because we got a chance to do a Q&A with him, and I said, Professor, are you trying to revive the idea of a rational ethics in the context of a new kind of natural science? In other words, are you trying to be the Kant of relativity and quantum mechanics? In other words, Kant said that he was the Newton of ethics, of metaphysics. And he was responding to Newtonian mechanics and to the new kind of physics that had been developed in the Enlightenment. He said Kant's job was to create an ethical theory that was intellectually respectable in the context of this new changed physical world. So I said, Professor, are you trying to do what Kant tried to do with regard to 20th century physics, what Kant was trying to do with Enlightenment physics? And he said in his own mumbling way, that's too complicated a question for me to answer right now, and just brush me off, okay? But that's what I think he's trying to do. Now, much as I admire Kant, there is a sort of hubris of the intellect in this guy. I mean, anyone who thinks that he can show you what the intrinsic limitations of reason itself are forever, this is the kind of theme that you get from Descartes, but that's the point of the Critique of Pure Reason. Yeah, there's an awful lot of hubris there. He will fight like a tiger to defend himself against that claim of hubris, but you have to have an, not quite almighty, but a very powerful faith in reason and its capacities, assuming that it's the skeleton key that's going to open every door to human problems. I'm not sure that's the case. In other words, I'm not sure that that assumption about reason is justified. All right? Maybe reason can't solve all our problems. There are two ways of looking at this, and we can go all the way back to the Greeks here. One, Mr. Hubris himself, Plato, says, no, once you get really rational and you think deep thoughts, you can solve every moral problem, and you can get precise right answers to politics and ethics and aesthetics and the whole 9 yards. Every problem can be solved by being reasonable. Just ask the philosopher king. And at the same time, I would point to Euripides. Now, Euripides, for those of you that know it, and you should know Euripides, is ironic about the human rational capacities. All right. He says, look, you are not rational creatures. You are potentially rational creatures. You are intermittently rational creatures. You are asymptotically rational creatures. But to tell yourself that you're a rational animal and that you can solve all your problems by being reasonable, I'm not sure that that's the case. So let me give you an example, okay? I think that we can do a pretty good rational analysis of whether you should murder your children. You shouldn't. But when it comes to a question like, say, abortion, are you sure that reason is going to guide us through that labyrinth? Because there are good arguments, serious arguments on both sides. Are you sure that there's one and only one univocal rational argument that covers every possible case? Maybe there is. I have yet to see it. And that's part of why people get so angry and scream so much about abortion. People raise their voices when they realize they don't know how to explain the fact that they're completely right. And the reason they don't know how to explain it is because they're not completely right. All right? So Habermas' idea of communicative action, yes, we can create some rough and ready understandings of what we think is rational and use these and implement them to solve some of our social problems. I think he goes too far in making the assumption that we should be able to do that for every problem that emerges. I'm not entirely convinced. What if, hypothetically, somebody like Euripides is right when he says the high point of rationality is for rationality to recognize its own limitations? Do you get the sense in reading anything by Habermas that he's recognizing the limitations of rationality, or that he's selling it as an all-purpose solution? Yeah.
So what I would say is that the terms of the rationality are agreed upon by the actors that are by the interlocutors, by the people that are talking.
Okay.
And that rationality is very situational, because he pulls on that American pragmatism, which is, the pragmatists really poo-pooed the rationalists because they were too hoity-toity. Okay. And that's kind of why, like with Habermas, by bridging that continental philosophy with the American pragmatism, that's one of the reasons I like him so much, is because it's like it's a very practical vision of rationality. And sure, it's very easy to make the argument, if everyone just was rational, everything would be perfect. Like, that's a silly argument to make. Okay. But I think that if there's an urge or a desire to be rational and a desire to be sincere in our communication with other people as we interact for the purposes of acting cooperatively.
Yep.
Why not? Why isn't that?
So the best we can get is a historically determined consensus. Right? Is that okay? The problem here with that historicism is that the snake eats its own tail, because the belief in historically situated consensus is in fact historically situated, which means that before this idea came up, that wasn't right or true, and after we get rid of this, it's not going to be right or true then either. This goes back to Leo Strauss's Natural Right in History. He points out that historicism is self-refuting, because if you think that it's only the historical context that allows us to make a provisional attempt at being rational, but that these are always in flux and always changeable, so we can move from, say, approving of slavery to disapproving of slavery, there's nothing intrinsically that prevents us from going back and then approving of it again. Okay, so then what have we accomplished? We said, well, we can create consensus. Why do we elevate that consensus to the level of rationality? The things people have created consensus about are sometimes genuinely terrifying, like racial inferiority, or scientific racism, or a whole collection of moral evils that were created by roughly rational consensus in a particular historical milieu. So the problem then is, how do we get this thing to stop, and how do we get crystals of truth? Plato is always going to respond to something like this, and he's going to say, are you sure that arithmetic is just a question of consensus? Okay, so it seems that we can sometimes create trans-historical agreement. And Plato would say, that's the real rationality. He'd say, Habermas, you're getting all German on me. Right? You're bringing in Hegel and Marx and all that historicist stuff. And the problem is, that's a kind of relativism that you're absolutizing. So the snake eats its own tail. Right? And look, I admire the pragmatists, because what they say is, it doesn't really matter whether something is true or not. See if it works. If it works, who cares? Well, Plato cares. Right? And the people who are going to disagree with you in a generation or a century, they also care. And if they were around, the people who had disagreed with you in an earlier century also care. So the problem is, when you historicize knowledge, what you end up is dehistoricizing historicism. It gets raised to the status of permanent knowledge. But by its own definition, that's not possible. He's too smart for his own good. I mean, I admire Habermas enormously. I think he's probably the greatest living philosopher. The reason why I think that is because as just a graduate student, he had the nerve to call Heidegger out and say, look, it's the 1950s now, and you haven't distanced yourself from Nazism. What's the score here? You owe the German people and German culture, an explanation for why your widely revered philosophy led you to get dressed up in a Nazi Halloween costume and be a supporter of the Nazi regime. It takes some big balls to do that if you're a graduate student, and he did that. And then his whole career was trying to revive and refurbish and make practical, and that's the tip of the hat to pragmatism, make practical the tradition of rational thought and rational argument. And that's a humane and benevolent and sane thing to do. The problem is that I think that there's something to be said for Euripides. We're only asymptotically rational, and not all our solutions, not all our problems can be solved by being rational. Let me give you an example. I think one of the great achievements of the human mind is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? This is the sense in which I'm a Christian, not in the magical sense with all the miracles and stuff. I believe in spite of the miracles, not because of them. Right? But the parable of the Good Samaritan, what I like about it is that, as far as I can see, that doesn't make any sense at all. What's it to you whether this guy lies on the road or not? It has nothing to do with your self-interest, and you're not likely to ever see this person again, and you could use that 2 pieces of silver to buy something for yourself. Maybe making sense isn't everything. I can't imagine any Greek thinker coming up with the parable of the Good Samaritan, because they'd ask, well, what sense does that make? Well, maybe making sense isn't everything. Or maybe what Jesus has done is seen what the limits of rationality are. And unlike Euripides, who's going to get all ironic then, he says, well, I'm going to go beyond your irony, and I'm going to tell you some things that are true about what's good that you're not going to be able to derive from any rational process. That's what makes him a prophet rather than a philosopher. I'm not sure that I would disdain it just because he can't give me a logical analysis of it. So if you see what I'm saying, Habermas is still back in that Western philosophical tradition trying to hold on to reason. And since he lived through the Nazi regime, I can understand why he would want to do that. The problem is, I think he's oversold rationality. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to take too much time.
No, go ahead. Push back. That's good. You're well appointed with that.
You want to move on? We can move on.
Okay. Think about it, and you can shoot me an email.
I'll just say this. I'm trying to think of how to put it quickly in my mind because there's other people in line here. But so from the context of how societies operate and how societies work, isn't rationality all we really have?
Well, no. We have benevolence for its own sake, like the parable of the Good Samaritan. Until you can explain to me why that's rational, or how you've manipulated the idea of rationality to include that, I don't believe it.
But we have to agree on that benevolence, right?
We have to agree on it, not on any rational basis. Agreeing with Jesus is an act of faith. Right, that's the whole point of Kierkegaard, right? So we may agree on it, but it's not a rational agreement. This is not the ideal speech situation. All right, somebody else take a crack.
Sorry.
No, and Jim, I thought that was great. Thank you for following up. I'm also glad to know your name now. Professor, the question I had, kind of building on this theology thing, I guess. So Locke invokes God a lot. Is rooted in the Bible, but last week you seemed to suggest that someone like Hobbes may have been doing that just to avoid Galileo's fate, paying homage to the church. Is Locke for real on that, or is he also paying homage like other Enlightenment folks?
I don't know. My guess is that he's something like a kind of deist, right? He's not going to stick by the letter of the law and not going to vouch for the miracles in the New Testament, but he is going to be a practical he's going to be practically interested in the influence that Christianity had in his society in England, and also in several other societies that he was familiar with. So what he would say is that, look, we deal with the hand we're dealt. If the people have these beliefs, let's include them and show them a useful respect. But I would emphasize useful there. I don't know that upon the miraculous or in the things that Hume would call improbable. So now, if you ever get a chance to read Leo Strauss, who's an important political philosopher, a lot of my teachers were taught by Strauss. You'll find that Strauss thinks he's an atheist, and the reason why he writes the letter concerning all these crazy religious zealots with the minimum amount of violence and bloodshed. So what does Locke really believe? I honestly don't know. My guess is, like most Enlightenment thinkers, when he's faced with the question and that you don't let him weasel out of it, he'll punt and become a sort of a deist. Yeah, there's some mind that created things and stuff, but it doesn't interfere with the world and certainly doesn't create miracles. So no resurrection, none of that plebeian stuff for a philosopher like him.
Okay.
That would be my guess anyway.
Okay. Thanks.
Take a shot. Another question.
Am
Come
I
on, you
next?
gotta put your hands up. Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering what you would think about this. In our discussion with Dr. Staloff, one of the things that I found really interesting, partly from my background in the UK, is how much of this screams UK middle class.
Yep.
Where the upper class here does not, the upper class and working class don't care because they can't progress, they can't move. The upper class doesn't need to worry about their position because they're never going to fall, and the working class can never rise. It's really only the middle class that has this idea that they can pull themselves up by their boots. Granted, as like, well, everyone should be able to do that. So yeah, I was wondering how much of that, I don't know if I have a question so much as like unpacking that idea in terms of how it influenced America, and particularly American optimism, in a way that does not exist.
Yeah, I think it's also roughly equally true on the continent as well. There's not the same degree of social mobility in France or the Low Countries or Germany. It occasionally happens, but it's hard to imagine Mark Zuckerberg in Austria, right? I can imagine him leaving Austria and going to Silicon Valley and making a ton of money. But if he tried to do that in Austria or in Germany or in France or in England, that would have been taxed away long before he became really rich. And in fact, inequality doesn't seem to get on people's bad side in England, for example, but rather upstarts that just recently became rich. That pisses them off rather than still having remnants of a landed aristocracy, which just makes people shrug their shoulders. Now, here's the deal. Here's how I think this works. America was lucky in the sense, and so was Canada, in the sense that when colonists came here, there really wasn't a landed aristocracy. So there were rich people, but they started out not very rich, just like everybody else. So they couldn't claim that their title to these vast estates goes back to, I don't know, the Vikings or whenever they won it by conquest. And there also wasn't the same idea of social immobility for the working class, with the exception of black slaves. That's a special problem, and that's the fly in the ointment of American political philosophy and American political history. But for white people or poor, there's always the chance of rising. A couple of reasons why. Number one, wages were always much higher here than they were back in the old country. And the reason why is this. America had lots of land to take. which looked to them like it was empty or nearly empty because Indians did not make intensive use of the land for most purposes, right? They were widely spread out, and they were even more widely spread out once they got hit with European diseases because that reduced the numbers enormously. So there was always more land to get. And if you were willing and plucky enough and courageous enough to go to the frontier, you could get land just by occupying it, and you would then have essentially capital that you could improve and increase, and then you would actually have a stock of money or something that could be turned into money. And what was usually done was, as the frontier was pushed, someone would clear the trees and start planting there, build a small house, a shack really, and then as the frontier moved further out, another couple of 100 miles, they would sell that improved land at a considerable upcharge from the fact that they didn't pay anything from it, and taking that money, they could now buy a much larger chunk of land on the frontier and then engage in that same process again. So in the course of a lifetime, if you started out as a 20-year-old man and you brought a gun and some salt and some gunpowder and a hatchet, you could do that 3 or 4 times, and you could be not wealthy, but you could be very comfortable, far more, and have far more possessions than anybody could have had in that same time back in England or on the continent. So in America, the element in productivity was based upon land and labor. There was a huge oversupply of land, and there was always a shortage of labor. So labor always brought in a higher wage here, real wage, than it did back there, which meant that if all you have to sell is your labor and you're getting land for free, you actually have a reasonable chance at social mobility. Now you get married and maybe you die at 40 or 45 because, again, lifespan wasn't then what it is now, but you have children, which means that some of your children are going to inherit the land you have at that time. They'll take care of your widow, and then others, particularly if they're boys that can take care of themselves, are going to repeat that process 100 or 150 miles out. So it's the fact that we don't have a landed aristocracy, and it's also the fact that it's possible for labor to rise because labor is scarce. That means that there's a great deal of social mobility in the US, and that people were better fed here, even just working people. And what that meant is that class divisions were much less sharply defined. You can also lose all your money here. There's lots of ways of speculating in land or stock, and you can lose everything. And then you're back at where you started. So the fact that there's genuine social mobility here means that the idea of property and the idea of keeping what you work for makes a bigger difference in this culture than on the continent. I think that's a big part of why the social welfare state has been so much less popular in America than it has been in England, right? We're still arguing about whether we should provide health care to everybody, which seems obvious to people generations ago in England or in France. We're saying, well, look, take care of yourself. Now, that's an attitude which may have found its sources in the 17th and 18th century. But until the frontier closes, and the frontier in America closes at 1890, all right, you could still go out and pick some land for yourself and improve it with your own work. I think that's the source of why Locke is so appreciated here and seems like something of an antique in England, all right? Socialist writers like Tawney used to say, look, Locke was fine in his time. Here's the historicism again. But in our time, we're now urbanized. We have a relatively rigid class structure. And even the class structure in England, as they say, is branded on your tongue. The accent that you use tells everyone what social stratum you come from, right? If you listen to the BBC and then you listen to, I don't know, Northern England working class accents, they're very different. Right? BBC is the Oxford and Cambridge accent, right? Working class people in Manchester or in Scotland speak a very different variation of English, and everybody knows who you are from the first time you open your mouth. Doesn't work that way in America. American English, because it's a kind of, I don't know, colonial patois. Includes all kinds of other extraneous stuff, and doesn't show class distinction nearly as readily. Right? We can tell something about people's geographical origins, but you can't tell whether their family was rich or poor just upon the kind of American English they speak. What else? Give us another one.
I had a question, which I think builds on the point that Garner made earlier about Locke's view on God. So I was interested in how consistent Locke's views around empiricism would have been, and ideas that would have appeared in understanding, considering human nature, and so on. How consistent those views would be, kind of the blank slate empiricist view of knowledge, would be with natural law and references to God within the second treatise, whether they're consistent or reconcilable.
That's a great question. Empiricism is intrinsically hostile to everything that's imported into the brain that's not sent there by the senses. So what the empiricists all try and do is get rid of the idea of innate ideas built into you. That's for rationalists. So his empiricist epistemology has to do some special pleading for things like natural law, because you don't observe the way the world ought to be. You observe the way the world is, as Hume pointed out when he made that distinction. So you're right. There's an anti-theistic element in all empiricists, but Locke is nothing if not moderate, and he is an anti-revolutionary thinker, except that he allows for the possibility of revolution, but he doesn't encourage it as a general rule. And the cost of denying the Christianity that he inherited in England at the end of the 17th century would be to throw him into obscurity. Remember that he published the second treatise. He had written it just before the Glorious Revolution of 1689. The Glorious Revolution swapped out, in a kind of bloodless palace coup, a Catholic monarch for Protestant monarchs, William and Mary of Orange, who were brought over. Now, he is wise enough to show respect for any set of ideas that is powerful enough to cash in that old monarch in favor of some new ones. And he is in favor of a right to revolution, and he's going to have to find some way of insinuating the legitimacy of religious belief, because it's so crucial to practical politics, although it doesn't easily fit with an empiricist view of the world. If you are a tabula rasa when you're born, then unless you actually see God and you talk to a burning bush or something, it's hard to explain where you're going to get that idea, except as a superfluous tradition. Now, Locke doesn't want to say that, because Locke is a moderate, in fact, many ways conservative man. He says, look, what holds our society, in particular our political life, together is a certain sort of rough consensus. Here's your Habermas for you about what makes a legitimate ruler. And in England, a legitimate ruler has to be a Protestant. Okay, if we're agreed on that, I don't want to rock the boat. We'll write in some special pleading for the existence of a God who really likes William and Mary, and then we'll proceed. Right? The people shall judge. Yeah, it's a jerry-rigged edition. It's not very elegant. It's not completely coherent, but he's wise enough to realize that coherence for its own sake in practical matters is often a genuine mistake. All right? Save me from perfectly consistent thinkers. Lenin was completely consistent. You sure you want this guy running your society? What else? Come on, I got a couple of hands up.
Okay.
Connor, or whoever you are, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things that I found interesting is that, well, Locke seems turned to America in his focus, and he's talking about the good Indian myth, where the only problem is that we have so much abundance that we need to share it, and it's easier if we have money instead of just apples and oranges. However, Hobbes, the way he looked at the world, he looked at the East and continental Europe, where you get invaded by the North, the south, the east, the west. And there the problem is that you need a local strongman to keep the pillaging bands away from you, or you need to be part of the pillaging band to avoid being killed by other people.
That's a very good point. In addition to the high wages that labor got in the New World, there's also the abundance of stuff in the New World. In other words, the average caloric intake, the average amount of possessions and clothing, even for indentured servants, for the most impoverished of white settlers, was greater than it was back home. That was a considerable part of the attraction for leaving home, because remember, leaving home is a wrenching experience, and most people will avoid it if they can, and for good reason. You never know what you're going to encounter out, in the vast beyond. Places that already have large populations are going to have more intense distribution problems, particularly if you have a landed aristocracy or the leftovers of a landed feudal aristocracy, and that they're demanding much more than they can actually consume. They're demanding what Torsten Veblen called the ability to engage in conspicuous consumption, which shows off how superior they are, because the price that has to get paid is that those that are on the bottom of society, who are socially immobile because they're getting a bare minimum, not much more, is that anytime that the crops fail, anytime that there's a war or an internal invasion or external raiders, you're going to have localized problems in even meeting people's minimal needs to be fed. And that means that you have to have a strong central government which can ad hoc tax certain portions of the country and move that grain or move that meat or fish to the other parts that are affected. So, the great example of this is something like Imperial China. They have all kinds of problems with their rivers. The rivers change course all the time. These cause floods and disasters, and this will happen at least once or twice a generation. In order not to have millions of people starve, the emperor has to have absolute control over this. He doesn't want to hear about anything about your Lockean rights to keep what you've grown. He's going to say, look, I want half of the grain that gets produced there, and I want it brought over there, and I want it brought over there now. That actually is a better adaptation to that kind of continental-sized country that has a gigantic population, because they started their population increases before the time of Christ. Right? China gets unified in 221 BC by a terrifying individual, Qin Shi Huangdi. And he did it by being a terrifying individual. But once he had that, there's not much in the way of political philosophy in the history of China. I know it sounds strange, but it's true. They got it right the first time. There's no point when you have, say, 100 million people within the bounds of Imperial China in Roman times. There's no point in having all of them vote. They're illiterate. They spend their time in rice paddies, growing rice for the most part, and it would be much ado about nothing. What you need is strong centralized power to make a country of that size and that complexity work. So there wasn't much debate the way there was in Western Europe, where you had political decentralization and various modes of political organizations tried out. The polis, which is a small area, you can decide, well, maybe we should try democracy, or maybe we should try an aristocracy or an oligarchy. Think of the Italian city-states. You had essentially oligarchical regimes, and then eventually one family would emerge preeminent. Okay, those kinds of transformations are tolerable in small spatial areas with relatively restricted populations. So there are circumstances, or this is actually what Montesquieu believes. If any of you ever read The Spirit of the Laws, he says, look, if you want to figure out what sort of government a group of people need, have a look at who the people are, how many of them there are, what kind of living they make, and also how big the country is. because your ability to have things like democracy is going to be contingent on your ability to communicate. It's much easier with instant communication to argue for democracy than it is when communication takes months or sometimes even years if you're spread out, say, among various islands. All right. Imagine the way Britain ruled India. Well, you can't have decision making done there and then vetted by England, because a ship isn't going to get to England for a year or more, and there's another year to come back to find out whether it's going to be okay. So there you need a direct and quite authoritarian regime. On the other hand, if you have a country the size of Iceland, where everybody is named Johansson and they're extremely homogenous, I mean, there are only 250 people in the whole country right now, and they're all roughly speaking related to each other. Well, that's an ideal place to have a democracy. Why? Because everybody has pretty much the same agreement, the same language, the same mores, and roughly the same income. If, on the other hand, you're trying to come up with a government for a place the size of, say, post-Soviet Russia, you can't have a democracy work there. It's too big, too many languages. There you're going to need something more authoritarian. And that's what they got, for better and mostly for worse, because what they got is run by a combination of the KGB and the Russian mafia with predictable results. What else?
Well, the other fun thing is that Locke really cares about fathers. If you have a good father, you listen to him. If you have a bad father, you replace him. Kind of like replace father by English monarch, and then it's not very subtle.
Okay, yeah. Family is natural for Locke in a way that it isn't for Hobbes, right? Because it's the war of all against all. Locke is much more realistic here. For the most part, children love their parents and parents love their children. There are exceptions to that rule, and the exceptions are terrifying and awful, but he assumes that for the most part, you're not going to have a problem within the family, right? So children are not full citizens and are not capable of making their own decisions until they reach their majority. And that's actually not such a bad idea. Democracy always has a problem with childhood. In other words, you have to create some number, 16, 18, 21, when you say you no longer have to have your decisions made for you. You are now allowed to make your own decisions. And the young people are always more interested in having that number reduced, and old people looking at them saying, I'm not so sure. But again, this is an Aristotelian virtue is a mean between two vices. We don't know what the exact right number is, and there probably isn't an exact right number, 17 years, 4 months, and 5 days, which is what Plato is hoping for and what Habermas is hoping for too. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that 3 years old is too young and 50 years old is too old. Right? We get a gerontocracy with the latter, and we get excessively foolish decision-making by children with the former. So we have a rough and ready sweet spot. The problem is it's not a point on the line, it's a line segment. One more question.
Doctor, since I think it was the second release on the Idea Store, I believe you had mentioned piety, and I was hoping if you could give your definition of piety again. I'd like to comment on it. Okay, good.
The Platonic dialogue called the Euthyphro is an aporetic dialogue. In other words, it comes to an impasse. And it's an ironic impasse because he's talking to a religion specialist who supervises things like sacrifices and religious rituals. That's who Euthyphro is. Euthyphro is also trying to kill his father using the law against murder because he wants to steal his father the inheritance early. So he says, you know what's really pious? It's really pious to accuse your father of a capital crime when it's under very dubious circumstances. And because I'm doing the will of the gods, I'm a pious guy, and it's very pious to have your father killed. Now, what the point here is that it's foreshadowing at the Athenians' decision to kill their father, their spiritual father, who is Socrates. If you look at the end of the Apology, you'll find that Socrates says, after I'm dead, I want you to treat my sons the way I treated you. What he's saying is he was the father of the city. So I thought about that for a long time, and I left it out of that 16 lecture series I did on Plato because I didn't know the answer. Having gotten older, I think I do. I think that piety is doing honor to God by being of service to men. I think that's a definition that Socrates would just shrug his shoulders about and say, yeah, well, okay, let's talk about something else, right? Because I think that's the answer. I could be wrong, and I'll always be willing to revisit it. That's why I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, so I was wondering, at the bottom of that, so there's a recognition of gods there, and so to me there's a sense of humility that underlies piety.
Yes.
And then doing service to men, for me, I think it comes through gratitude. There's a certain energy that I understand, and so there's a humility and gratitude, and to me, that is my understanding of piety. And do you feel that might, sort of align with what you're saying?
Yes, I do. That's a very fine answer. Gratitude is a small virtue, but the lack of gratitude is a huge vice. That's entitlement, and there's altogether too much of this right now. Your point is very well taken. Right? Gratitude is something that people should learn, and that's actually good for them and good for the world around them. I'm at the point now where I'm 65 and I have advanced cancer, and I know I'm going to die. I've been doing that Heideggerian living with death for 11 years now because it was metastatic when they found it. I'm actually pretty chill about it. In other words, it doesn't worry me at all. I am living a happy life, and I'm not worried in the slightest. And this has nothing to do with an afterlife. I'm just chill about it. I'm really reconciled to it. And I feel nothing but gratitude. You see, here's the key thing. People that get a terminal illness, that get pissed off with God or nature or whatever it is they think is in charge of things and rage against their mortality, they have gotten the misapprehension that they're entitled to exist. Who the hell are you? What is it that gives you the entitlement to exist? What, they didn't give you 300 years when that's what you really deserved? I'd slap you upside the head. Right? Don't you talk to me like that. You are lacking in gratitude because you don't realize that you're lucky to have existed at all. Look at all the zillions, I don't even know what the right number is, of particles there are in the known universe. A very small, vanishingly small number of them got together and started thinking about itself and turned out to be you. If you don't have gratitude for that, you're not going to have gratitude for anything. And a lack of gratitude to God or to nature or whatever it is that runs things is both futile and it's the conduct of a spoiled child. Right? There are a lot of grown-up people that are essentially spoiled children who never stop being spoiled children. So we are lucky to have ever existed at all. We're lucky to be part of that tiny fragment of the material world that's conscious of itself and also conscious of its life as well as its mortality. And if you're not grateful to the universe or to nature or to God or whatever you want to attach to the ultimate reality, you're a damn fool, right? So gratitude is something that all of you should embrace because you're lucky to exist at all. You could be a rock at some god-awful nebula on the other side of the universe, but instead you were fortunate enough to be you. I don't care if you think there's a deity behind it. Maybe it's just nature that did it. But then you owe nature a big thank you. And that's part of what I have against Schopenhauer, right? His philosophy is deeply lacking in gratitude. And he doesn't think that existence is a gift. All I can say is, and again, this is going to be something where being reasonable isn't everything. I don't know that I have a good knockdown reasonable argument for that, but I think it's true anyway. Right? So my point then is this: gratitude is absolutely essential to a happy life and to a good life. And I feel lucky and privileged to have gotten both the pain and the pleasure, the ups and the downs, the whole thing of my life. And I'd say yes to the whole thing. And the idea of shaking my fist at the sky and saying, you owe me more, the hell he does, or it does, whatever you want to call it. I'm not entitled to anything. Something you should keep in mind, and this is a maxim that's worth engraving on your brain. God owes us nothing. Let that settle into your brain. And that's the cure for a lot of spoiled child behavior and spoiled child thinking. All right. Since God owes you nothing, I'm going to take my leave of you with that happy thought. And I will talk to you next week. And here's what we're doing. If I remember correctly, we are doing Dickens' Hard Times next week. Is that so? Oh, yeah. All right. Too few people read Dickens anymore, but this is the shortest of Dickens' main novels. So it's accessible. It's like 250 pages, which for Dickens is restrained. Okay. But it is one of the greatest novels ever written. It is rippingly funny. And I have to admit, this is a novel that everybody should read. So I will leave you with that. God owes us nothing, and you owe Dickens a chance to read Hard Times. I will talk to you all then. God bless.
Thank you.
God bless,
God
Professor.
bless. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.